The first meeting the lecture hall was full of quiet voices and restless movement. Students were preparing their notes, adjusting their chairs, waiting for the professor to arrive. The air held a mix of curiosity and pressure, the kind of tension that comes when people expect knowledge but fear judgment. In the back row, Keanu Reeves sat quietly. He had come not as a celebrity but as a learner. His eyes were calm and his posture was relaxed, yet there was something in the way he carried himself that drew attention. Some students whispered to each other, wondering if it was really him. Others just stared in disbelief, unsure why someone like him would sit among them in an ordinary classroom. When the professor walked in, the room turned silent. He was known for his strict discipline and sharp tongue. He did not like distractions, and he believed authority must always be shown. His eyes scanned the students until they stopped on Keanu. There was a flicker of surprise, but it quickly turned into a hard stare. "You must be lost," the professor said, his voice filled with coldness. "This is not a stage and this is not Hollywood. Are you sure you are in the right place?" The class froze. Some students gasped softly, others looked down, afraid to get caught watching. The professor's words carried not only sarcasm but also a sharp edge of disrespect. It was as if he had already judged Keanu without knowing why he was there. Keanu did not react with anger. He looked at the professor with steady eyes and spoke in a soft tone. "I am here to learn just like everyone else. If that is all right." The room grew heavier. The professor frowned, almost offended by the calmness in Keanu's voice. "Learning is not about pretending to be humble," he said. "You people live in a world where everything is easy. You cannot understand real struggle." Those words cut through the silence like a knife. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some wanted to defend Keanu, but no one had the courage. They knew the professor's temper and feared his reaction. Keanu, however, did not break. He lowered his eyes for a moment, then lifted them again, carrying no pride, no argument, only patience. "I understand what you mean," he replied gently, "but struggle is not always visible. We all carry stories that are hidden." That answer shocked the class. A few students felt goosebumps on their skin. The professor, however, looked displeased. He turned his back and started writing on the board, dismissing the moment as if it had no value. But inside the students' hearts, something had shifted. They had seen humility where they expected defense, and kindness where they expected anger. As the lecture continued, the professor gave sharp questions, testing everyone. When he turned to Keanu, his tone grew sharper. "If you are so serious about learning, then tell me, what is the foundation of respect in this subject?" Keanu paused. Everyone expected him to stumble, to fall silent, to show he did not belong. Instead, he spoke slowly, with thought in every word. "The foundation of respect is not only knowledge," he said. "It is the way we listen to each other, even when we think the other person has nothing to give." The room became completely silent again. No one expected that answer. Some students looked at each other, their eyes wide, while others looked down, touched by the truth in his words. The professor said nothing. He turned back to the board, but his shoulders tightened. His silence revealed that Keanu's words had reached deeper than he wanted to admit. The lecture ended, and students packed their bags. Some rushed out, some lingered, but many looked at Keanu one last time before leaving. They saw not an actor, not a star, but a man who carried himself with a kind of strength that did not need to shout. When the room was almost empty, one student walked up to Keanu. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Thank you for saying what you said. No one ever talks to him that way, and you did it without disrespect. I think everyone needed to hear that." Keanu smiled softly, his eyes filled with warmth. "Thank you," he replied. "Sometimes kindness is the only answer we can give." As he left the hall, the rain outside had begun to fall gently, tapping against the windows. The sound felt like a quiet echo of what had just happened inside, a reminder that even the smallest drops can change the silence of the air. The story was only beginning, and no one in that classroom knew how much it would grow, how many hearts it would touch, and how the professor himself would be tested in ways he never imagined. The growing tension the next morning, the classroom carried a different air. Students entered with hushed voices, still thinking about what had happened the day before. Whispers spread across the room. Some repeated Keanu's words, while others wondered why the professor had been so harsh. When Keanu walked in, the eyes of many followed him. He did not dress to stand out, nor did he carry himself with pride. His steps were calm, his expression gentle, as if he had no memory of the sharp words thrown at him earlier. Yet his presence seemed brighter, like a quiet light in a room that had too many shadows. The professor entered shortly after. His footsteps were firm, his face hard. He began the lecture without greeting, diving into complex theories as if nothing else mattered. But every now and then his eyes flicked toward Keanu, sharp and searching like someone waiting for an error. About halfway through the class, the professor turned suddenly. "You," he said, pointing directly at Keanu. "Stand up." The room went still. Students looked at one another nervously. Keanu rose without hesitation, his movements slow and respectful. "Tell me," the professor demanded, "what is the difference between knowledge and wisdom? And do not give me some poetic answer. Give me something real, something useful. Let us see if you belong here at all." The challenge hung heavy in the air. Everyone leaned forward slightly, their breath caught. They were expecting either embarrassment or a clash. Keanu looked thoughtful. His eyes did not show fear, only patience. After a pause, he spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Knowledge is when we know the words of a book or the rules of a subject. Wisdom is when we live those words with kindness, when we use that knowledge to make life better, not only for ourselves, but also for others." A ripple went through the room. Some students nodded almost unconsciously, moved by the simplicity and truth of his answer. The professor's face tightened. He gave a small, cold smile. "That may sound nice in a movie," he said, "but in this classroom it is not enough. Here we deal with facts, not feelings." Keanu bowed his head slightly, showing no resistance. "I understand," he said softly, "but sometimes feelings carry truths that facts alone cannot hold." The students were stunned again. A boy in the front row clenched his pen, whispering under his breath, "He's not even arguing, he's just calm." The professor turned back to the board, but his writing grew sharper, his hand pressing harder with the chalk. It was clear he felt challenged, though Keanu had never raised his voice or disrespected him. After class, as students left, two of them approached Keanu near the hallway. One was the girl from before, her eyes bright with gratitude. The other was a quiet young man who had rarely spoken in class. "You really make me think," the girl said. "It feels like every word you say has a story behind it." The young man added, "He tries to break you, but you don't break." "How do you stay so calm?" Keanu smiled faintly. "When someone throws fire at you, you can throw fire back and the flames will only grow, or you can bring water and maybe the fire will shrink. I just choose water." His words lingered with them long after he walked away. Later that week, a surprise came. The professor announced a special group discussion. He called on students randomly, testing their ideas. When he pointed to Keanu again, the class felt a hush of anticipation. "You say respect comes from listening," the professor said sharply. "So tell us, what do you do when the person in front of you does not deserve respect?" The trap in the question was clear. Some students shifted uncomfortably, expecting Keanu to falter. But Keanu looked around the room, his gaze gentle, as if he was not just answering the professor, but speaking to everyone present. "Respect is not always about the other person," he said. "Sometimes it is about who we choose to be. If I give respect only when it is easy, then it is not real. True respect is when we offer it even to those who deny it to us, because in that moment, we are showing our own strength, not theirs." The silence that followed was deeper than before. Some students lowered their eyes, ashamed of moments when they had mocked others or stayed silent in the face of unkindness. The professor, however, looked unsettled. He did not reply immediately. His eyes narrowed and his lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without a word, he ended the discussion and dismissed the class early. As the students filed out, whispers filled the corridor. "Did you hear that?" He turned the question upside down. The professor couldn't even respond. But deep in his office, behind a closed door, the professor sat alone, his hands folded tightly together. For the first time in many years, he felt something he did not like to admit. He felt questioned, not by rebellion, but by kindness. Outside, the rain returned once more, tapping softly on the windows, as if echoing the gentle persistence of Keanu's spirit. And so the story began to stretch beyond a classroom. Whispers grew stronger, students carried his words into their own lives, and the professor, though he did not show it, was being drawn into a test he could not escape. Cracks in silence the following week brought with it an air of unease. Though the classroom looked the same, filled with open books, the tapping of pens, and the soft shuffle of feet, something invisible had changed. The students no longer looked at their professor with the same unquestioned respect. Instead, their eyes often shifted toward Keanu, waiting to see how he would answer, what he would say, how he would remain calm in the face of storms. The professor noticed. Every time a student's attention drifted from his lecture to Keanu's quiet presence, he felt a sting deep inside his pride. He had ruled these rooms for years with authority, with fear, with sharp words that no one dared question. And yet here was this man, sitting silently, speaking softly, and somehow his voice echoed louder than any lecture. One afternoon, as the lecture ended, the professor called out sharply, "Reeves, stay behind." The class froze for a moment. Whispers darted across the room before students filed out quickly, some glancing back with worry. Keanu remained seated, his expression calm. When the door shut, the professor's voice cut through the silence. "What are you trying to do here? You think this classroom is some place for your performance? You think you can charm these students with your so-called humility?" Keanu looked at him with steady eyes, not harsh, not defensive, only sincere. "I am not here to perform," he said gently. "I am here because I believe learning never ends, even for me." The professor scoffed, but the sound carried more frustration than confidence. "Do not pretend with me. People like you are worshipped by the world. You do not know the meaning of respect because you have never been forced to earn it." Keanu let the words settle. He did not rush to reply. After a long pause, he spoke in a voice soft enough to almost sound like a whisper. "You may see only what fame shows, but you do not see the nights of emptiness, the losses that cut deep, the mistakes that haunt me. Respect is not given to me by the world. It is something I must still learn to give, even when it hurts." The professor turned away, his jaw tight. He wanted to dismiss those words, yet they clung to him like shadows. Later that evening, the professor sat alone in his office. The lamplight cast long shadows on the books stacked around him. He pulled out an old photograph from the bottom drawer, a faded picture of himself as a young man, standing beside his mentor. He stared at it for a long time. In that moment, a memory surfaced. Years ago, he had been in Keanu's place. Eager, curious, hopeful, but his mentor had crushed him with coldness, mocking him, pushing him to the edge. And instead of responding with patience, he had turned bitter. He had built his teaching style around authority and fear, believing that was the only way to protect himself from the kind of humiliation he once endured. The echo of Keanu's words, "Respect is when we offer it even to those who deny it to us," pressed heavily on his mind. But instead of softening, he felt a rush of anger. He did not want to be reminded of his own weakness. He clenched the photograph tightly, whispering to himself, "He will not break me." The next day, the professor's tone grew harsher in class. His questions were sharper, almost designed as traps. Students felt the tension rise, but every time he turned to Keanu, expecting him to stumble, Keanu responded with patience and thoughtfulness. During one heated moment, the professor challenged, "Tell me, Reeves, if humility is so powerful, then why does the world still worship pride and success? Why do people chase wealth and recognition instead of kindness?" The class held its breath. It was the kind of question meant to corner him. Keanu paused, his gaze sweeping over the students, as if making sure his answer belonged not only to the professor, but to everyone listening. "Because pride shines fast," he said, "but humility shines long. Pride excites people in the moment, but kindness lives in their hearts forever. The world chases what is loud, but what is quiet stays with us longer." Several students shivered at his words. The boy in the front row whispered, "He's right, it stays." The professor's lips pressed together. He looked down at his notes, his chest heavy with unspoken turmoil. That night, a storm broke outside. Rain poured against the windows, thunder rolled across the city. Keanu walked alone under the downpour, his jacket soaked but his steps steady. He welcomed the rain as if it was washing away the heaviness of the day. Far away in his office, the professor sat with the same storm pressing on his heart. He looked again at the photograph of his younger self and his old mentor, and for the first time in years, he felt his chest ache. The bitterness he carried, the harshness he gave, had roots deeper than he wanted to admit. But instead of peace, the storm inside him grew stronger. He whispered into the empty room, "I will not lose to him." What neither of them knew was that this storm was only the beginning, and that both their lives were about to change in ways no one expected. The unseen battle, the classroom, no longer felt the same. What once was a place of routine had now become a stage for silent battles. Every lecture carried an invisible tension. The professor stood tall, his voice strong, but behind his sharp questions there was an urgency, as though he was trying to prove something not just to his students but to himself. The students noticed. Some whispered about it after class, saying the professor seemed different, more restless, more unsettled. Others admitted that they came to class not only to hear the lecture but to see what Keanu would say, how he would respond. Slowly, the balance of respect in the room was shifting, and the professor felt it slipping through his hands. One afternoon, the professor introduced a debate session. He divided the class into two groups, assigning each side to argue about respect. The room buzzed with nervous energy as students prepared. But when it came time to assign speakers, he pointed straight at Keanu. "You will lead one side," the professor said. His tone was sharp, almost daring. "Let us see if your words can hold against reason." The other students exchanged glances. Some were excited, others nervous. Keanu, however, simply nodded, accepting the challenge without hesitation. The debate began. Voices rose, arguments collided, students quoted books, studies, and theories. Some argued that respect must be earned through strength and achievement, that people only honor those who stand above them. Others claimed that respect should be equal, given freely, regardless of power. When it was Keanu's turn, the room grew quiet. He did not rush. His voice was steady, each word carrying weight. "Respect is not a coin to be traded," he said. "It is not something we wait for others to deserve. It is something we choose to give because it shows who we are. When we give respect only to those we admire, we are not showing strength. True strength is when we offer it even to those who may never return it." The room was silent for a long moment. Some students lowered their eyes, ashamed of times they had disrespected others. Others leaned forward, drawn by the power in his calmness. The professor cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. "Those are pretty words," he said coldly, "but words do not build the world, action does." Keanu looked at him gently. "Then maybe our first action should be the way we speak to each other, because words can heal or they can wound. Every wound starts with a word." The students murmured among themselves, moved by his reply. For the first time, a few of them openly nodded in agreement, right there in front of the professor. The professor's face hardened, but deep inside, something cracked. He felt the weight of his own past words, sharp, cold, often cruel. He remembered students he had dismissed, moments when his harshness had silenced young voices. He told himself it was discipline, but now, for the first time, he wondered if it had been something else. Bitterness passed down from his own wounds. After class, as students packed their bags, one of them, a boy who had always been quiet, approached Keanu. "Your words, they made me think," he said softly. "My father always shouts at me. I thought respect only comes with fear. But maybe it doesn't have to." Keanu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Fear can make people obey, but it can never make them feel safe. Respect without kindness is only control. You deserve more than fear." The boy's eyes grew wet, and he quickly looked away, whispering, "Thank you," before hurrying out. That night, the professor sat alone again, the photograph of his younger self still on his desk. The storm outside had quieted, but inside him the storm only grew louder. He remembered how his mentor had once told him, "The world will crush you if you are soft. Only hardness will keep you standing." He had believed those words so deeply that he built his entire career upon them. But now, every word from Keanu felt like a mirror showing him a different truth, a truth he did not want to face. He closed his eyes, gripping the photograph tightly. "He is making me weak," he whispered to himself. Yet deep down, he felt a quiet fear. What if Keanu was not making him weak, but showing him the strength he had forgotten long ago? The days ahead promised no peace, for the battle between pride and kindness was no longer hidden. It was alive, shaping every moment, every glance, every silence in that classroom. And soon, the professor's own past would come crashing into the present, forcing him to face not just Keanu, but himself. The breaking point, the tension inside the classroom, had grown like a rope pulled too tight. Every lecture felt less like teaching and more like a test between two worlds, one ruled by pride and fear, the other carried by patience and quiet kindness. Students felt it in their bones, the invisible clash that happened every time the professor looked at Keanu. On a rainy afternoon, the air was heavy. Drops slid down the window panes as the class settled into their seats. The professor walked in, his face colder than ever. Without wasting time, he turned to the students. "Today we will discuss failure," he announced sharply. "How many of you believe failure teaches respect?" A few hands rose hesitantly. The professor nodded once, then turned directly to Keanu. His voice was edged with challenge. "And you, Reeves, what do you know of failure? Men like you live with success handed to them. Tell us, what does failure mean to someone who has the world at his feet?" The words hit the room like thunder. Students froze, their hearts pounding. Some looked at Keanu with pity, others with fear for how he might respond. Keanu sat in silence for a long moment. The rain outside seemed to grow louder. Then, in a voice soft yet firm, he answered, "Failure has followed me many times. I have lost people I loved. I have seen dreams collapse. I have walked through loneliness so deep it felt like silence would swallow me. Fame does not protect a heart from breaking. Success does not stop grief from finding you. Failure has taught me that respect is not given to the strong alone. It belongs to all who rise again after falling. The classroom fell still. Some students blinked back tears, realizing for the first time that behind the image of a star stood a man who had walked through shadows. But the professor's face grew hard. His voice rose, sharper than before. You speak of pain as if it makes you wise, but pain is only pain. It does not make you better. It only makes you weaker. For the first time, students turned their eyes toward the professor, not with fear, but with quiet unease. They had begun to see the cracks in his armor, the bitterness dripping through his words. Keanu looked at him, his eyes calm, his voice steady. Pain does not make us weaker. Bitterness does. Pain can break us, but kindness is what puts the pieces back together. The silence that followed was unbearable. The professor clenched his fists on the desk, his body trembling with emotions he had buried for years. Then, without warning, his voice cracked, not with anger, but with something deeper. You think I do not know pain? He thundered. You think I do not know what it is to be humiliated, to be crushed, to be treated as if you are nothing? The students gasped. It was the first time they had ever seen their professor lose control. His voice shook as he continued. I once stood where you stand. I spoke with hope, with light, but my mentor, he destroyed me. He laughed at me, called me weak, made me believe that softness was shame. And I swore never again would I allow anyone to look at me with pity. I became hard because it was the only way I knew how to survive. The classroom was frozen. The rain outside beat harder against the windows, echoing the storm inside his chest. Keanu's eyes softened. His words came not as an argument, but as a whisper. I am sorry you were treated that way. No one deserves that. But do not let his cruelty live through you. Do not let the pain he gave you become the pain you give to others. The professor's breath caught. His eyes wavered, torn between anger and the sting of truth. The students sat in silence, their hearts pounding. For the first time, they saw their professor not as an unshakable figure of authority, but as a man scarred by his past. The image of him shifted in their minds, and with it, the balance of respect in the room began to change. The battle was no longer between pride and humility alone. Now it was a battle against old wounds, against shadows that had been carried for decades. And though the professor tried to hide it, everyone knew something inside him had cracked, and it would never be the same again. The mirror of truth the next few days felt heavy, as though the air inside the classroom carried the weight of what had been revealed. The students still listened to their professor, but their eyes no longer held the same fear. They had seen him break, seen him admit to the scars of his past. Respect for him remained, but it was different now, no longer blind, no longer unquestioning. The professor, however, grew more restless. He spoke faster during lectures, his hands gripped the chalk harder, his eyes often darted toward Keanu with a mix of resentment and unease. At night, he could not sleep. The photograph of his younger self stayed on his desk, staring at him like a ghost. One evening, after another long day of teaching, the professor stayed late in the classroom. He sat alone, the lights dim, the silence thick. He thought of his mentor's voice, the mocking laughter, the cruel lessons that had shaped his own hardness. For years he believed he had buried it, but now every word Keanu spoke brought those wounds back to life. As he sat there, the door opened quietly. Keanu stepped in. He carried no books, no papers, only the same calm presence that had unsettled the professor from the start. You should not be here, the professor muttered, his voice tired. Keanu walked slowly to the front row and sat down, his hands resting on the desk. I stayed, he said softly, because I think you carry too much alone. The professor's jaw tightened. I do not need your pity. This is not pity, Keanu replied. This is listening. Sometimes we need someone to hear the parts of us we never speak. The professor's eyes burned. For a long time he said nothing, but then the words slipped out like cracks in stone. I was humiliated in front of everyone. I was told I was worthless. I swore I would never be weak again, so I became strong. But my strength it turned into cruelty. His voice shook, the bitterness falling away to reveal pain raw and unguarded. Keanu leaned forward, his tone low and steady. You were never weak. Surviving that pain was strength. But when you let his cruelty live inside you, that was when you lost yourself. You do not have to carry his voice anymore. The professor's hands trembled as they gripped the desk. And if I let it go, what am I then? What is left of me without the hardness? What is left, Keanu said gently, is the part of you that still wants to teach, to guide, to help others grow. That part never left. It has only been buried under pain. Let kindness bring it back. The room went silent. The professor felt his chest tighten, his throat heavy. For the first time in decades, tears filled his eyes. He turned away quickly, ashamed, but Keanu did not look at him with judgment, only with quiet respect. Unknown to them, a few students had returned to collect their forgotten books. They stood at the doorway, unseen, hearing everything. Their eyes widened, their hearts heavy with what they had just witnessed. The professor wiped at his face roughly, as though trying to erase the weakness, but the truth was already out. Keanu rose slowly from his seat. "Pain can chain us," he said, "but kindness can break the chain. You taught me something too. You showed me how deep scars can run. Now let me remind you, scars can heal." Then he walked to the door, pausing only once before leaving. "You are not alone in this. Not anymore." The professor sat in silence long after Keanu was gone, his hands trembling, his heart torn open. The photograph on his desk looked different now, not just a reminder of pain, but of who he once dreamed of becoming. And in the quiet hallway, the students who had overheard wiped their own eyes. They knew this was no longer just a story about a professor and a famous man. It was about every person who had ever been hurt, every person who had ever chosen bitterness over healing, and the chance to choose differently. The battle was reaching its end, but the question remained. Would the professor embrace the kindness offered to him, or return to the chains of his past? The choice the next morning, the classroom was filled with an unusual silence. Students sat waiting, their eyes restless, their minds heavy with what had been happening. The whispers that once carried curiosity had turned into respect, for Keanu, for his words, and even for the hidden pain of their professor. When the professor entered, something about him looked different. His steps were slower, his shoulders less rigid, his eyes softer though still tired. He stood at the front of the class and looked over the faces that watched him, not with fear, but with a quiet expectation. For a long time he did not speak. Then he set his notes aside and placed both hands on the desk. "Before we begin," he said, his voice low but steady, "I need to tell you something. I have taught for many years. I thought respect came from control, from strength, from making others feel small. I thought that if I was feared, I would never be humiliated again. But I was wrong." The students listened, their hearts beating fast. The professor continued, his voice cracking at times. "I was shaped by cruelty. I carried it and I gave it back to others. I told myself it was discipline, but really it was my own pain speaking. Yesterday, someone reminded me that respect is not about power. It is about kindness, and I must confess I had forgotten what that means." His eyes lifted, and for the first time in years they were not hard, they were human. "I cannot change my past. I cannot undo the harshness I have given, but I can choose what I become now, and I choose to begin again with humility." The room was silent. Some students felt tears rise, others lowered their eyes, overwhelmed. Then slowly Keanu stood. He did not speak long. He only said, "Thank you. It takes great strength to say what you just said. This is what real respect looks like." The professor bowed his head slightly, a gesture that shocked everyone. Never before had they seen him bend, not even a little. One by one, the students began to clap. At first softly, then louder, until the sound filled the entire room. It was not applause for a lecture, nor for a star sitting among them. It was for a man who had chosen to face his own shadow and step into the light. The professor felt the sound surround him. It did not feel like pity. It did not feel like mockery. It felt like release. For the first time, the weight on his chest began to lift. After class, many students stayed behind. They spoke quietly to the professor, sharing their own stories of pain, of fear, of moments when they felt small. He listened, truly listened, in a way he had not done in years. Keanu watched from the side, his heart calm. He knew this was not about him. It was about what kindness can awaken in others. He did not seek credit nor recognition. He only wanted to leave behind a reminder that gentleness can heal even the hardest stone. Later, as the sun broke through the rain clouds, the professor walked out of the building. The photograph of his younger self remained on his desk, but now it no longer haunted him. It reminded him instead of who he still could be. And as Keanu stepped out into the sunlight, the world felt brighter. He carried no pride, only peace. He had shown that kindness in the face of disrespect was not weakness, it was the deepest strength. The story had begun with a clash, but it ended with understanding. Not perfect, not finished, but changed. Because sometimes all it takes is one act of humility to remind the world that respect is not demanded. It is given, and in giving it, hearts are touched forever.